So in front of me here, I have the Cyberspace Pirates demo I published last month. Just gonna skim through it a little bit here. By the way, sometimes there's a little bit of lag that happens while I'm streaming, so this usually updates a little bit quicker. And you can also change the preview level, so you could get faster playback if a setting you have is having a bit of delay. So, some new features for 1.2. The first one off the bat is I've introduced a section where you can set preferences for the add-on. So if I go to Edit, Preferences, I've already pre-selected ActionBoards here. You can see now with 1.2 and later, we've introduced this section here for preferences. So there's a section where you can have it to toggle on if you don't want to use the action camera rig by default. You can check this on, so when you make a new file, it will just use a standard camera instead of using the action camera rig, which is the rig that is built in to ActionBoards. There's also another checkbox if you're, say, working with just a 2D production and you don't want everything to be in perspective. You can check this, which will make your cameras by default in orthographic. And then you can also change your default screen resolution. So, for example, if I go into this scene here, I can go into my setup options to change around the dimensions. So if I wanted this really narrow dimension here, this will update automatically, but before you would have to change this every time you made a new project. But now, with this Preferences tab, you can input a custom resolution, so when you make a new file, it will have that resolution when you start. Another option here for those live action folk, there's an option to change the symbols on the corner for the scenes from SC for scene to SH for shot. So if I check this, you can see now in the corner we have SH scene 9, and then have it unchecked, and then it's SC for scene again. And then, yeah, SH. And back to SC. The new thing is having an option to change what the default setup resolution will be. So if I bring up preferences, let's say we want to make this like 3000 by 1000. Then I make a new Blender file. If I do this and I create a new scene, so let's go desktop to the demo. We'll save this one as untitled for now, but you can see now it's created. And now we have 3000, 1000. So if you have a client that has, you're doing work that's more widescreen, or maybe if you're doing something for like mobile videos that you need like a dimension that's taller for a phone, then you can set in your defaults for what you're usually working with. So when you're making a new board, it will just always be your default preference. Yeah, and on top of that, we went over this. There's also an option to show the file name in the burn-in now. So what this will do is when you render out your animatic with the burn-in enabled, in the corner here, it will have the name of your file minus the blend. So in this case, it's SciPy May Demo Board Final. It will save that in the corner. So if you were working on something that had multiple sequences, you could say like, maybe this is SciPy sequence 1, and then you have sequence 2. So when you render them out, you can know what sequence or project it's from in the corner as well. So that will happen when this is enabled. For the sake of saving time when rendering, ActionBoards previously had render samples locked to 8. Now I've given the users control over it, so you can go down as low as 2 render samples if you want, or all the way up to 32. So just to show you a quick example of this in action, I'm going to find a scene to show you how like the shadows can differ. So this is a good example. So we can see a lot of shadows in the scene, right? So they're pretty choppy, and that's because we're only doing 6 rendering samples. But if I go into the preferences here, I can increase this to say 32, the maximum. I wouldn't advise this because this would be pretty slow down computers quite a bit, so I wouldn't advise going super high, but if you have a beefier computer that can handle that, then by all means. I'm currently running a 2070 Super, so it's a little bit old, but still a pretty good graphics card. So you can see I've changed the number, but it hasn't updated yet. This will only update once you leave and come back into it. So you can see now the shadow has become a lot more smooth. There's more rendering samples. So I'm just going to put that back to 6. You can see even when you jump back into the editorial view, you can see the update already. There's this feature here, which was in 1.0 already, which is force correct workspace. So what this means is if I go into my editorial here, right? So we have the editorial workspace for this editorial view, but it's not designed to work when you're in the storyboard view, so it will force you back into this view. So no matter how many times I click the storyboard tab, it brings me into editorial. Similarly, if I'm in a scene like here and I try going to the editorial, it will force me back here. The reason this is in beta right now is sometimes these menus, where they're placed when you go back and forth, will sometimes glitch. In this case, it's not glitching out, but it depends. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. The downside is, like, menus might get, like, overlapped slightly, so you might not hit the button you mean. So that's why it's still labeled as a beta feature. The advantage of having it on is if you're new to Blender, for example, we're inside a scene, and you click editorial, you might think the editorial view brings you to the editorial scene. They're two different things. Like, this is a special work view that's meant to work with the editorial scene, which I could look up here, which is this. So they're two separate entities, but when this option is toggled on, it makes sure that, like, the proper scene or you're working in is in the proper workspace context. So that's what that does. And another thing that's as a beta features right now is a thing that says show beta features. It's on by default, but you can turn it off. So I'll go into a different scene where we have some dialogue to show this as an example. So I'm going to bring this up. And you can see here we have the annotation window where we can just, type whatever in, right? But there's nothing underneath of it. So now if I go into my preferences here, and I show beta features, it will now reveal the scene transitions. So this is still also considered a beta feature because there's some cases where I'll show you an example right here. So if I were to go in here, so say I have a scene and I want to do a transition. So if I do a wipe transition, the way to achieve that is it's actually moving or wiping the scene, so now they're overlapping, which could cause an issue if I go into the scene it's going into and say I want to put a fade from white in here, maybe not all the way down there, but if I do that, it now messes up the stack order. So when you're rendering and stuff, things get a little bit weird. So I'm gonna undo that, and you can also delete these just by hitting the X key to delete markers. Yeah, I use the marker system to add in the transitions and the dialogue. There's another feature too, which I put type whatever in here. But if, say, I put a exclamation point before my text, if I do that, it now changes it to a top note that appears in red. Yeah, so that's also been there since version 1. One change that has happened to the way this interface is treated is the scene and the dialogue text size. This now scales with your resolution. So if I were to, say, make this like a 2000 by 2000 square, if I go out, the text scales accordingly, so it won't get cut off if you're at like a smaller resolution or a larger resolution. It will scale to make sure you can read all the text regardless of what size you have your frame set to. I'm actually gonna set this back to default.